Romeo and Juliet. The two chief families in Verona were the rich Capulets and the Montagues. There had been an old quarrel between these families, which had grown so serious and produced such fierce hatred between them that it had even affected the remotest kindred, the followers and retainers of both sides. A servant of the house of Montague could not meet a servant of the house of Capulet, nor a Capulet encounter a Montague by chance without fierce words and occasional bloodshed. Frequent were the brawls resulting from such accidental meetings which disturbed the happy quiet of Verona's streets. Old Lord Capulet made a great supper, to which many fair ladies and many noble guests were invited. All the admired beauties of Verona were present, and all comers were made welcome if they were not of the house of Montague. At this feast of Capulets, Rosaline, beloved by Romeo, son of the old Lord Montague, was present. Though it was dangerous for a Montague to be seen in this assembly, yet Benvolio, a friend of Romeo, persuaded the young lord to go to this gathering wearing a mask, so that he might see his Rosaline, and, seeing her, compare her with some choice beauties of Verona, who, he said, would make him think his swan a crow. Romeo had small faith in Benvolio's words. Nevertheless, for the love of Rosaline, he was persuaded to go. For Romeo was a sincere and ardent lover, one who lost his sleep over love, and fled society to be alone to think of Rosaline, who looked down on him and never repaid his love with the least show of courtesy or affection. Benvolio wished to cure his friend of this love by showing him many other types of ladies and company. To this feast of Capulets, then, young Romeo with Benvolio and their friend Mercutio went masked. Old Capulet bid them welcome, and told them that ladies who had their toes unplagued with corns would dance with them. And the old man was light-hearted and merry, and said that he too had worn a mask when he was young, and could have whispered a tale in a fairy lady's ear. And they fell to dancing, and Romeo was suddenly struck with the exceptional beauty of a lady who danced there, like a snowy dove trooping with crows. So richly did her beauty and perfections shine above the ladies, her companions. While he uttered these praises, he was overheard by Tybalt, a nephew of Lord Capulet, who knew him by his voice to be Romeo. And this Tybalt, being of a fiery and passionate temper, could not bear to have a Montague come under cover of a mask to sneer and scorn at their formal celebrations. And he stormed and violently raged, and would have struck young Romeo dead. But his uncle, the old Lord Capulet, would not allow him to do any injury at that time, both out of respect to his guest and because Romeo had conducted himself like a gentleman, and everybody in Verona praised Romeo as a virtuous and well-governed youth. Tybalt, forced to be patient against his will, restrained himself, but swore that this vile Montague should at another time dearly pay for his intrusion. The dancing being done, Romeo watched where the lady stood, protected by his mask, which might seem to excuse in part the liberty he took. He ventured in the gentlest manner to take her by the hand, calling it a shrine. If he profaned by touching it, he was a blushing pilgrim, and would kiss it for atonement. Good pilgrim, answered the lady, your devotion is much too mannerly and too courtly. Saints have hands which pilgrims may touch, but kiss not. Have not saints lips, and pilgrims too? Said Romeo. Ay, said the lady, lips which they must use in prayer. Oh then, my dear saint, said Romeo, hear my prayer, and grant it, lest I despair. In such loving talk they were engaged, and when the lady was called away to her mother, and Romeo, inquiring who her mother was, discovered that the lady whose peerless beauty he was so much struck with was young Juliet, daughter and heir to the Lord Capulet, the great enemy of the Montagues, and that he had unknowingly engaged his heart to his foe. This troubled him, but it could not dissuade him from loving. As little rest had Juliet when she found that the gentleman that she had been talking with was Romeo and a Montague, for she had been suddenly smitten with the same hasty and unthinking passion for Romeo which he had conceived for her. And it seemed to her an amazing birth of love that she had fallen in love with an enemy, her enemy, and that her affections should settle there, where family considerations should induce her chiefly to hate. It being midnight, Romeo and his companions departed. However, they soon missed him, for, unable to stay away from the house where he had left his heart, he leaped the wall of an orchard which was at the back of Juliet's house. Here he had not been long thinking about his new love when Juliet appeared at a window above, through which her unusual beauty seemed to break like the light of the sun in the east. The moon, which shone in the orchard with a faint light, appeared to Romeo as if it were sick and pale with grief at the brighter radiance of this new sun. And, as she leaned her cheek upon her hand, he passionately wished himself a glove upon that hand, that he might touch her cheek. She, all the while thinking herself alone, heaved a deep sigh, and exclaimed, Ah me! Romeo, enraptured to hear her speak, said softly and unheard by her, Oh, speak again, bright angel, for such you appear, being over my head like a winged messenger from heaven, whom mortals fall back to gaze upon. She, unconscious of being overheard, and full of the new passion which that night's adventure had given birth to, called upon her lover by name, thinking him absent. O Romeo, Romeo, said she, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father, and refuse thy name, for my sake. Or if thou wilt not, be but my sworn love, and I no longer will be a Capulet. Romeo, thus encouraged, would gladly have spoken, but he wished to hear more. The lady continued talking passionately to herself, as she thought, still scolding Romeo for being Romeo and a Montague. She wished that he had some other name, or that he would no longer use that hated one. For that name, which was no part of him, he should have her instead. At these loving words, Romeo could restrain himself no longer, replying as if her words had been addressed to him personally, and not merely in fancy. He bade her call him love, or whatever other name she pleased, for he would no longer remain Romeo, if that name was displeasing to her. Juliet, alarmed to hear a man's voice in the garden, did not at first know who it was. That, shielded by the night and darkness, had thus stumbled upon her secret. But when he spoke again, though her ears had not heard 100 words of what he said, yet so nice is a lover's hearing, that she immediately knew him to be young Romeo. She remonstrated with him on the danger to which he had exposed himself by climbing the orchard walls, for if any of her kinsmen should find him there, it would be death to him, being a Montague. "Aleck," said Romeo, "there is more peril in your eye than in 20 of their swords. If you will but look kindly upon me, lady, I am safe against their enmity. Better that my life should be ended by their hate than that hated life should be prolonged to live without your love." "How came you into this place?" said Juliet, "and by whose directions?" "Love directed me," answered Romeo. "I am no pilot. Yet if you were as far apart from me as that vast shore which is washed with the farthest sea, I should dare much for such a prize." A crimson blush came over Juliet's face, unseen by Romeo because of the night, when she thought how, unawares, she had revealed her love to Romeo. She would gladly have recalled her words, but that was impossible. Gladly stood on ceremony and have kept her lover at a distance, as the cushion of prudent ladies is to frown and act contrary, and harshly refuse their suitors at first, to stand off and act coyly or indifferent where they most love, that their lovers may not think them too lightly or too easily won. For whatever is hard to win is valued all the more. But there was no room in her case for denials, or putting off, or any of the customary arts of delay and prolonged courtship. Romeo had heard from her own tongue, when she did not dream that he was near, a confession of her love. So with an honest frankness, she confirmed the truth of what he had before heard, addressing him by the name of fair Montague. Love can sweeten a sour name. She begged him not to assume that her easy yielding was due to trifling or as an unworthy mind, but that he must blame, if it were a fault, the accident of the night, which had so strangely revealed her thoughts. And she added that though her behavior to him might not be as proper as a woman's should be, yet she would prove truer than many who pretended to be prim and modest. Romeo was beginning to call the heavens to witness that nothing was farther from his thoughts than to believe anything dishonorable about such a lady, when she stopped him, begging him not to swear, for although she joyed in him, yet she took no joy in the vows that had passed between them that night. They were too rash, too unadvised, too sudden. But when he urged her to exchange a pledge of love with him that night, she said that she already had given him hers before he requested it, meaning when he overheard her confession. However, she would take back what she had then given for the pleasure of giving it again, for her generosity was as boundless as the sea, and her love as deep. From this loving meeting she was called away by her nurse, who slept with her and thought it time for her to be in bed, for it was near daybreak. But hastily returning, she said 3 or 4 words more to Romeo, the meaning of which was that if his love was indeed honorable and his purpose marriage, she would send a messenger to him tomorrow to appoint a time for their marriage, when she would lay all her fortunes at his feet and follow him as her lord through the world. While they were settling this point, Juliet was repeatedly called by her nurse, and went in and returned, and went and returned again, for she seemed as jealous of Romeo going from her as a young girl of a bird which she will let hop a little from her hand and pluck back with a silken thread. And Romeo was as loath to part as she, for the sweetest music to lovers is the sound of each other's voices at night. But at last they parted, wishing each other sweet sleep and rest for that night. The day was breaking when they parted, and Romeo, who was too full of thoughts of his beloved and that blessed meeting to allow him to sleep, instead of going home, set off for a monastery nearby to find Friar Lawrence. The good friar was already at prayer, and seeing young Romeo about so early, guessed rightly that he had not slept that night, but that some youthful love sickness had kept him awake. He was right in assuming the cause of Romeo's wakefulness to be love, but he made a wrong guess at the person, for he thought that his love for Rosaline had kept him awake. But when Romeo revealed his new passion for Juliet and requested the assistance of the friar to marry them that day, the holy man lifted up his eyes and hands in a sort of wonder at the sudden change in Romeo's affections, for he had shared all Romeo's confidences of his love for Rosaline, and his many complaints of her disdain. He then said that young men's love lay not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes. But Romeo, replying that he himself had often scolded him for doting on Rosaline, who did not return his love, whereas Juliet both loved and was beloved by him, the friar agreed in some measure with his reasons. He felt that a marriage between young Juliet and Romeo might fortunately be the means of healing the deep breach between the Capulets and the Montagues, which no one more regretted than this good friar, who was a friend to both the families and who had often tried to act as a peacemaker between them to no avail. Partly moved by policy and partly by his fondness for young Romeo, to whom he could deny nothing, the old man consented to join their hands in marriage. Now was Romeo blessed indeed, and Juliet, who knew his plan from a messenger whom she had dispatched according to promise, did not fail to be early at the cell of Friar Lawrence, where their hands were joined in holy marriage. The good friar prayed heaven to smile upon the marriage. In the union of this young Montague and young Capulet, he hoped to bury the old strife and long disagreements of their families. The ceremony being over, Juliet hastened home, where she waited impatiently for the coming of night, at which time Romeo had promised to come and meet her in the orchard, where they had met the night before. The time passed slowly, as the night before some great festival does to an impatient child. The ceremony being over, Juliet hastened home, where she waited impatiently for the coming of night, at which time Romeo had promised to come and meet her in the orchard where they had met the night before. The time passed slowly, as the night before some great festival does to an impatient child who has gotten new finery which it may not put on till the morning. That same day, about noon, Romeo's friends, Benvolio and Mercutio, walked through the streets of Verona, were met by a party of the Capulets with the headstrong Tybalt at their head. This was the same angry Tybalt who would have fought with Romeo at old Lord Capulet's feast. He, seeing Mercutio, accused him bluntly of associating with Romeo, a Montague. Mercutio, who had as much fire and youthful blood in him as Tybalt, replied to this accusation with some sharpness. In spite of all Benvolio could say to soften their anger, a quarrel was beginning when Romeo himself passed that way. At this, the fierce Tybalt returned from Mercutio to Romeo and called him by the disgraceful name of villain. Romeo wished to avoid a quarrel with Tybalt above all men, because he was a kinsman of Juliet and much loved by her. Besides this, young Montague had never thoroughly entered into the family quarrel, being by nature wise and gentle. The name of Capulet, which was his dear lady's name, was now rather a charm to quiet anger than a watchword to excite fury. So he tried to reason with Tybalt, whom he greeted mildly by the name of good Capulet, as if he, though a Montague, had some secret pleasure in uttering that name. But Tybalt, who hated all Montagues as he hated hell, would not listen and drew his weapon. Mercutio, who did not know of Romeo's secret reasons for desiring peace with Tybalt, looked upon his refraining from a fight as a sort of dishonorable surrender. With scornful words, he provoked Tybalt to get involved in his first quarrel with him, and Tybalt and Mercutio fought, till Mercutio fell, receiving a death wound, while Romeo and Benvolio were vainly endeavoring to separate the combatants. Mercutio being dead, Romeo kept his temper no longer, but flung back the scornful name of villain which Tybalt had given him, and they fought till Tybalt was slain by Romeo. This deadly brawl occurring in the midst of Verona at noon, the news of it quickly brought a crowd of citizens to the spot, among them the old lords Capulet and Montague, with their wives. Soon after arrived the prince himself, who being related to Mercutio, whom Tybalt had slain, and having had the peace of his government often disturbed by these brawls of Montagues and Capulets, came determined to enforce the law most strictly against those who should be found to be offenders. Benvolio, who had been eyewitness to the fight, was commanded by the prince to tell how it had all started. This he did, telling as much of the truth as he could without hurting Romeo, softening and excusing the part which his friends had taken in it. Lady Capulet, whose great grief at the loss of her kinsman Tybalt made her seek complete revenge, urged the prince to mete out strict justice to his murderer, and to pay no attention to the statements of Benvolio, who, being Romeo's friend and a Montague, spoke partially. Thus she pleaded against her new son-in-law, who she did not yet know was her son-in-law and Juliet's husband. On the other hand, could be seen Lady Montague pleading for her child's life and arguing with some justice that Romeo had done nothing worthy of punishment in taking the life of Tybalt, which was already forfeit to the law because of his having slain Mercutio. The prince, unmoved by the passionate arguments of these women, on a careful examination of the facts, pronounced judgment. By his sentence, Romeo was banished from Verona. Heavy news to young Juliet, who had been but a few hours a bride, and now by this decree seemed forever divorced. When the news reached her, she at first gave way to rage against Romeo, who had slain her dear cousin. She called him a beautiful tyrant, a fiend angelical, a ravenous dove, a lamb with a wolf's nature, a serpent heart hid with a flowering face, and other such contradictory names, which denoted the struggles in her mind between her love and her resentment. But in the end, love got the mastery, and the tears which she shed for grief that Romeo had slain her cousin turned to drops of joy that her husband, whom Tybalt would have slain, was alive. Then came fresh tears, wholly of grief over Romeo's banishment. That word was more terrible to her than the death of many Tybalts. Romeo, after the fight, had taken refuge in Friar Lawrence's cell, where he was first informed of the prince's sentence, which seemed to him far more terrible than death. To him, it appeared there was no world out of Verona's walls, no living out of the sight of Juliet. Heaven was there where Juliet lived, and all beyond was purgatory, torture, hell. The good friar would have consoled him in his grief with philosophy, yet this frantic young man would hear of none, but like a madman tore his hair and writhed on the ground as he said, to take the measure of his grave. From this unbecoming state he was roused by a message from his dear lady, which a little revived him. Then the friar took the opportunity to point out to him the unmanly weakness which he had shown. He had slain Tybalt, but would he also slay himself as well as his dear lady, who lived but for him? The noble form of man, he said, was but a shape of wax when it lacked the courage which should keep it firm. The law had been lenient to him, for instead of death, which he had incurred, the prince had only sentenced him to banishment. He had slain Tybalt, but Tybalt would have slain him. There was a sort of happiness in that. Juliet was alive, and, beyond all hope, had become his dear wife. For this he was most happy. But all these blessings, as the friar made them out to be, Romeo refused to recognize, like a sullen, misbehaved wench. The friar cautioned him that those who despaired, he said, died miserably. Then, when Romeo was a little calmer, he advised him to go that night and secretly take his leave of Juliet, and thence proceed at once to Mantua. Here he should stay till the friar found a suitable occasion to announce his marriage, which might be a joyful means of reconciling their families. Then, he said, he did not doubt that the prince would be moved to pardon him, and he would return 20 times more joyfully than he went forth grief-stricken. Romeo was convinced by this wise counsel of the friar, and took his leave to go and seek his lady, proposing to stay with her that night, and by daybreak journey alone to Mantua. To this place the good friar promised to send him letters from time to time, acquainting him with the state of affairs at home. That night Romeo passed with his dear wife, gaining secret admission to her chamber from the orchard in which he had heard her confession of love the night before. That had been a night of unmixed joy and rapture. But the pleasures of this night and the delight which these lovers took in each other's company were sadly tempered by the prospect of parting and the fatal adventures of the past day. The unwelcome daybreak seemed to come too soon, and when Juliet heard the morning song of the lark, she would have liked to persuade herself that it was the nightingale which sings by night. But it was too truly the lark which sang, and a harsh and unpleasing note, it seemed to her. The streaks of day in the east too clearly pointed out that it was time for these lovers to part. Romeo took his leave of his dear wife with a heavy heart, promising to write to her from Mantua every hour in the day. When he had descended from her chamber window and stood below her on the ground, in that sad, fearful state of mind in which she was, he appeared to her eyes like one dead at the bottom of a tomb. Romeo had similar misgivings, but now he was forced hastily to depart, for it was a death for him to be found within the walls of Verona after daybreak. This was but the beginning of the tragedy of this pair of star-crossed lovers. Romeo had not been gone many days before the old Lord Capulet proposed a match for Juliet. The husband he had chosen for her, not dreaming that she was already married, was Count Paris, a gallant, young, and noble gentleman, no unworthy suitor for young Juliet if she had never seen Romeo. The terrified Juliet was sadly bewildered at her father's offer. She pleaded she was too young for marriage. She complained that the recent death of Tybalt had left her spirits too weak to face a husband with any show of joy. However, how improper it would look for the family of the Capulets to be celebrating a marriage feast when the funeral rites were hardly over. She pleaded every reason against the match but the true one, namely, that she was married already. But Lord Capulet was deaf to all her excuses, and, in an overbearing manner, ordered her to get ready, for by the following Thursday she should be married to Paris. Having found her a husband, rich, young, and noble, such as the proudest maid in Verona might joyfully accept, he could not bear that because of a pretended coyness, as he interrupted her refusal, she should set up a bar to her own good fortune. In this crisis, Juliet turned for help to the friendly friar, always her counselor in distress. He asked her if she had courage to undertake a desperate solution. She answered that she would go into the grave alive rather than marry Paris, with her own dear husband living. He then directed her to go home and appear merry and give her consent to marry Paris, according to her father's desire. Then, on the next night, which was the night before the marriage, she was to drink the contents of a vial, which he would then give her. The effect of this would be that for 42 hours after drinking it, she would appear cold and lifeless. When the bridegroom came to fetch her in the morning, he would find her, to all appearance, dead. Then she would be borne, as the custom in that country was, uncovered on a bier, to be buried in the family vault. If she could cast aside womanish fear and consent to this terrible trial, in 42 hours after waking, if she could cast aside womanish fear and consent to this terrible trial, in 42 hours after swallowing the liquid, so surely did it work, she would be sure to awake, as from a dream. Before she would awake, he would let her husband know their plan, and he should come in the night and take her away from there to Mantua. Love and the dread of marrying Paris gave young Juliet strength to undertake this horrible adventure, and she took the vial of the friar, promising to observe his directions. Going from the monastery, she met the young Count Paris, and pretending modesty, promised to become his bride. This was joyful news to Lord Capulet and his wife. It seemed to put youth into the old man, and Juliet, who had displeased him greatly by her refusal of the Count, became his darling again, now that she promised to be obedient. The whole house was abuzz with excitement at the approaching wedding. No cost was spared to prepare a celebration such as Verona had never before witnessed. On the Wednesday night, Juliet drank the potion. She had many misgivings. First, she was worried that the friar, to avoid the possibility of being blamed for marrying her to Romeo, had given her poison. But then he was always known for a holy man. She also feared she might awake before the time that Romeo was to come to her. She was then filled with terror of the place, a vault full of dead Capulets, bones, and a chamber where Tybalt, all bloody, lay rotting in his shroud, horrors that might be enough to drive her out of her mind. Again, she thought of all the stories she had heard of spirits haunting the places where their bodies had been laid to rest. But then her love for Romeo and her strong dislike for Paris returned, and she desperately swallowed the potion and lost consciousness. When young Paris came early in the morning with music to awaken his bride, instead of a living Juliet in her chamber, there was only the tragic sight of a lifeless corpse. What death to his hopes! What confusion then reigned of a lifeless corpse! When young Paris came early in the morning with music to awaken his bride, instead of a living Juliet in her chamber, there were only the tragic sight of a lifeless corpse. What death to his hopes! What confusion then reigned through the whole house! Poor Paris stood lamenting his bride, whom most hateful death had cheated him of and had divorced him. Poor Paris stood lamenting his bride, whom most hateful death had cheated him of and had divorced from him even before their hands were joined. But still more piteous it was to hear the mourning of old Lord and Lady Capulet, though they had but this one poor loving child to rejoice and find comfort in. Cruel death had snatched her from their sight, just as these devoted parents were on the point of seeing her fortunes improved, as they thought, by a promising and favorable match. Now all things that had been prepared for the festival were used to provide for a black funeral. The wedding cheer served for a sad burial fest. The wedding cheer served for a sad burial feast. The bridal hymns were changed to sad dirges, the gay instruments to melancholy bells, and the flowers that should have been strewn in the bride's path now served but to strew her corpse. Now, instead of a priest to marry her, a priest was needed to bury her, and she was borne to church indeed, not to strengthen the cheerful hopes of the living, but to swell the dreary numbers of the dead. Bad news, which always travels faster than good, now brought the dismal story of his Juliet's death to Romeo at Mantua. This happened before the messenger could arrive, who had been sent by Friar Lawrence to inform him that these were mock funerals and only an imitation of death, and that his dear lady would lie in the tomb but for a short while, awaiting Romeo's coming to release her from that dreary vault. Shortly before, Romeo had been unusually joyful and light-hearted. He had dreamed in the night that he was dead, a strange dream that gave a dead man leave to think, and that his lady came and found him dead, and breathed such life with kisses into his lips that he revived and was an emperor. And now that a messenger came from Verona, he thought surely it was to confirm some good news which his dreams had foreshadowed. But when the opposite of this flattering dream appeared, and he heard that it was his lady who was dead in truth, whom he could not revive by any kisses. He ordered horses to be gotten ready, for he determined that night to visit Verona and see his lady in her tomb. And as mischief is swift to enter into the thoughts of desperate men, he recalled a poor, hungry-looking druggist whom, and as mischief is swift to enter into the thoughts of desperate men, he recalled a poor, hungry-looking druggist whose dilapidated shop in Mantua he had lately passed. He had said to himself at the time, perhaps with some inkling of his own fate, if a man were to need poison, which by the law of Mantua it is death to sell, here lives a poor wretch who would sell it to him. These words of his now came into his mind, and he sought out the druggist who had first pretended some qualms about selling such drugs. But when Romeo offered him gold, which in his poverty he could not resist, he sold him a poison. If he swallowed it, he told him, though he had the strength of 20 men, it would quickly dispatch him. With this poison, he set out for Verona to view his dear lady in her tomb, planning, when he had looked upon her, to swallow the poison and be buried by her side. He reached Verona at midnight and found the churchyard, in the midst of which was situated the ancient tomb of the Capulets. He came provided with a light, a spade, and a wrench, and was proceeding to break open the monument when he was interrupted by a voice, which, calling him vile Montague, ordered him to stop his unlawful business. It was the young Count Paris, who had come to the tomb of Juliet at that untimely hour of night to strew flowers and to weep over the grave of her who should have been his bride. He knew not what an interest Romeo had in the dead, but knowing him to be a Montague, and, as he supposed, a sworn foe to all the Capulets, he judged that he had come by night to do some villainous shame to the dead bodies. Therefore, in an angry tone, he demanded that he stop, and, as a criminal condemned by the laws of Verona to die if he were found within the walls of the city, he would have captured him. But Romeo urged Paris to leave him and warned him by the fate of Tybalt, who lay buried there, not to provoke his anger or draw down another sin upon his head, by forcing him to kill him. But the Count, in scorn, refused his warning, and laid hands on him as a criminal. This Romeo resisted. They fought, and Paris fell. When Romeo, with the help of a light, discovered that he had slain Paris, who, he learned on his way from Mantua, had been promised Juliet in marriage, he took the dead youth by the hand, like a companion in misery, and said that he would bury him in a triumphal grave, meaning in Juliet's grave, which he now opened. There lay his lady, like one over whom death had no power to change a feature or complexion in her matchless beauty. For she lay yet fresh and blooming, as she had when she fell asleep after swallowing that deadening poison. For she lay yet fresh and blooming, as she had when she fell asleep after swallowing that deadening potion. Near her lay Tybalt in his bloody shroud. When Romeo saw him, he begged pardon of his lifeless corpse, for Juliet's sake called him cousin, and said that he was about to do him a favor by putting his enemy to death. Here Romeo took his last leave of his lady's lips, kissing them. Then he swallowed that poison which the druggist had sold him, whose action was fatal and real, not like the pretended one which Juliet had swallowed, the effect of which was now nearly fading. She was about to awake to complain that Romeo had come too soon. For now the hour had come at which the friar had promised that she should awake, having learned that the letters which he had sent to Mantua had never reached Romeo because the messenger had been unfortunately detained. The friar came himself, provided with a pickaxe and lantern to deliver the lady from her confinement. But he was surprised to find a light already burning in the Capulet's vault, and to see swords and blood near it, and Romeo and Paris lying lifeless by the monument. Before he could begin to speculate on how these fatal events had taken place, Juliet awoke from her trance. Seeing the friar near her, she remembered where she was, and the reason for her being there. She asked for Romeo, but the friar, hearing a noise, bade her come out of that place of death and of unnatural sleep, for a greater power than they could contradict had thwarted their plans. Then, being frightened by the noise of people coming, he fled. But when Juliet saw the cup clasped in her true love's hands, she guessed that poison had been the cause of his death. She would have swallowed the drugs if any had been left. She kissed his still warm lips to see if any poison still clung to them. Then, hearing people coming nearer, she quickly unscathed a dagger which she wore, and stabbing herself, died by her true Romeo's side. The watch, by this time, had come up to the place. A page belonging to Count Paris, who had witnessed the fight between his master and Romeo, had given the alarm which had spread among the citizens, who went up and down the streets of Verona, confusedly exclaiming, "A Paris, a Romeo, a Juliet," as the details had inaccurately reached them. The uproar finally brought Lord Montague and Lord Capulet out of their beds, with the prince, to inquire into the cause of the disturbance. The friar had been stopped by some of the watch, coming from the churchyard, trembling, sighing, and weeping in a suspicious manner. A great crowd being assembled at the Capulet's monument, the prince ordered the friar to tell what he knew of these strange and disastrous events. And there, in the presence of old lords Montague and Capulet, he faithfully related the story. And there, in the presence of old lords Montague and Capulet, he faithfully related the story of their children's fatal love, the part he had taken in promoting their marriage, hoping by that union to end the long quarrels between their families. He told how Romeo, lying there dead, was husband to Juliet, and Juliet, there dead, was Romeo's faithful wife. How before he could find a favorable opportunity to reveal their marriage, another match was arranged for Juliet. He told how, to avoid the crime of a second marriage, she swallowed the sleeping potion, as he advised, and all thought her dead. How meanwhile he wrote to Romeo to come and take her to Mantua when the force of the potion should wear off, and by what unfortunate mischance to the messenger the letters never reached Romeo. More than this the friar could not tell, since he knew only that when he had come himself to deliver Juliet from that place of death, he had found Count Paris and Romeo slain. The rest of the story was supplied by the page, who had seen Paris and Romeo fight, and by the servant who had come with Romeo from Verona. To this servant the faithful lover had given letters to be delivered to his father in the event of his death. which bore out the friar's words. In these letters, Romeo confessed his marriage to Juliet, asked the forgiveness of his parents, acknowledged buying the poison from the poor druggist, and revealed his intention of coming to the monument to die and lie with Juliet. All the facts agreed, clearing the friar from having had any hand in these complicated deaths, except unintentionally through his well-meant but too artful schemes. And the prince, turning to these old lords, Montague and Capulet, rebuked them for their brutal and unreasoning hatred, and showed them what a scourge heaven had laid upon such offenses, that it had found means, even through the love of their children, to punish their unnatural hate. And these old rivals, no longer enemies, agreed to bury their long strife in their children's graves. And Lord Capulet requested Lord Montague to give him his hand, calling him by the name of brother, as if in acknowledgment of the union of their families by the marriage of the young Capulet and Montague. Capulet said that Lord Montague's hand, in token of restored friendship, was all he demanded for his daughter's marriage portion. But Lord Montague said he would give him more, for he would raise a statue of pure gold to her, so that as long as Verona kept its name, no figure should be so esteemed for its richness and workmanship as that of the true and faithful Juliet. And Lord Capulet, in return, said that he would raise another statue to Romeo. So did these poor old lords, when it was too late, strive to outdo each other in mutual courtesies, while so deadly had been their rage and enmity